A casual hoodie. A luxury showroom. And one jaw-dropping reveal. Sound of a car engine idling, then turning off. Daryl pulls into the parking lot of Prestige Motors, the flagship dealership he recently acquired in sunny Scottsdale, Arizona. Sound of car door opening and closing. The desert heat shimmers off the sleek, luxury vehicles parked out front, their glossy finishes practically glowing in the afternoon sun. He parks his modest SUV in an unmarked spot at the back and steps out, taking a moment to scan the dealership's facade. Soft ambient sound of distant chatter. Daryl isn't dressed for attention, quite the opposite. A simple gray hoodie, slightly worn jeans, and sneakers make up his outfit. His decision to dress casually is deliberate. Today, he isn't just the owner, he's an observer. He wants to see how the dealership operates when no one knows the new boss is watching. Sound of showroom doors opening, followed by a faint whoosh of air conditioning. Stepping into the air-conditioned showroom, Daryl is met with the faint scent of leather and fresh wax. Rows of pristine cars gleam under the bright showroom lights. Sound of muffled laughter. Inside, a small group of employees chat near the front desk. The faint hum of their conversation fades as Daryl walks in. He notices the subtle glances exchanged between them, their eyes briefly flicking to his hoodie and sneakers. Soft, observational tone in voiceover. He feels the shift in energy, the kind that speaks louder than words. Then, from across the room, she appears. Sound of sharp footsteps on a polished floor. Susan. She's a middle-aged woman with sharp features and an even sharper gaze. Her tailored blazer and polished heels suggest authority, while the clipboard tucked under her arm adds an air of efficiency. Sound of footsteps stopping abruptly. Susan approaches, her smile polite but tight, her voice cool and clipped. "Excuse me, can I help you with something?" Pause, sound of subtle background music softening. Daryl smiles calmly. "Just here to look around," he says casually, gesturing toward the cars. Susan's eyes narrow as she scans him from head to toe, her polite mask slipping just slightly. "Are you shopping for a car?" she asks, her tone carrying an edge of doubt. Daryl nods. "Something like that." Music shifts slightly, signaling subtle tension. Susan purses her lips. "Well, we cater to a very specific clientele here. Most of our inventory requires pre-qualification. Perhaps I could recommend." Sound of someone calling out in the distance. "Hey Susan, the delivery guy's here." Her attention wavers momentarily, but her gaze quickly returns to Daryl, ensuring he doesn't wander too far. Voiceover resumes with a knowing tone. Daryl raises an eyebrow, his tone steady but pointed. "You're assuming I'm not qualified?" The question lands heavily, catching Susan off guard for a brief moment. But she recovers quickly, stiffening her posture. "I'm just trying to save you some time," she replies, her smile forced. "These vehicles start at 6 figures. Maybe I can direct you to." Daryl doesn't flinch. He's calm, composed, but the subtle sting of her words doesn't go unnoticed. "That's quite the assumption," he says softly. Pause, sound of faint murmurs in the background. The weight of his words lingers in the air, and for a moment, Susan falters. Sound of clipboard rustling as she adjusts it. "Well, I'll be back with a list of options," she says curtly, walking away briskly. Sound of her footsteps fading into the distance. Daryl watches her go, his expression unreadable. Turning back to the showroom, he admires a sleek silver coupe, its aggressive design reflected back at him in its glossy finish. Voiceover shifts to a reflective tone. "This," he murmurs, "is going to be an interesting day." "Certainly. Here's the continuation." Sound of light chatter picking up again. Daryl stands in the center of the showroom, hands in his pockets, surveying the room. He isn't quick to judge, but Susan's dismissive attitude is hard to ignore. Around him, the staff resumes their conversations, though every now and then, he catches a glance in his direction. It's the kind of scrutiny he's become used to over the years, the silent judgment, the unspoken assumptions. Sound of heels approaching again, sharper this time. Then, Susan returns, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hands, her brisk stride and forced smile betraying her annoyance. "All right," she says, stopping a few feet away from him. "I've compiled a few options that might be more suitable for your situation." Sound of paper shuffling. Darryl tilts his head slightly. "My situation?" Susan's gaze tightens. "Yes," she replies, her voice clipped. "These are more accessible models. Reliable, economical, and, well, practical." She hands him a printout of pre-owned vehicles, each with a detailed description and price tags well below the dealership's typical offerings. Sound of paper rustling as Darryl takes it, silence hanging for a moment. Darryl scans the list. A used sedan, an older SUV, a compact hybrid. He raises an eyebrow, faint amusement tugging at the corner of his lips. He folds the paper and tucks it into his pocket. "Appreciate the effort," he says evenly. Susan seems momentarily disarmed by his response but quickly recovers, her hands now resting on her hips. "Listen," she says, her voice dropping slightly, as if she's about to share a secret. "I'm just trying to be realistic with you. Prestige Motors isn't for everyone. I don't want to waste your time." Darryl meets her gaze, his expression calm but unwavering. "And what exactly makes you think I'm not your target customer?" Sound of the tension thickening. Susan hesitates but only for a split second. "I've been doing this a long time," she says. "I can tell when someone's out of their depth." "Out of their depth?" Darryl repeats, his voice neutral, almost thoughtful. "Interesting." Silence hangs for a moment. There's a flicker of uncertainty in Susan's eyes, but she presses on. "I'm just being honest," she says. "It's better to be upfront than to have someone leave disappointed." Darryl lets out a soft chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "Honest, huh? I like honesty." Pause, sound of Darryl taking a slow breath. "How about this," he says, his tone casual but firm. "You let me speak to the owner. Think we can make that happen?" Susan's eyebrows shoot up, clearly caught off guard. "The owner?" she echoes. "That's right," Darryl replies, his tone light, almost conversational. "I'd like to have a word with them." Sound of a door slightly creaking open, murmurs in the background. Susan's lips twitch into a strained smile. "Well, that's not possible today," she says quickly. "The owner doesn't just drop by for casual visits. They're a busy person." "I'm sure they are," Darryl says, nodding slightly. "But maybe you could give them a call, let them know I'm here. I think they'd want to meet me." Sound of Susan shifting uneasily. Her smile tightens, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Look, sir," she says, her voice now edged with frustration, "I'm trying to be as polite as possible, but this is getting ridiculous. I have other customers to attend to. If you're serious about buying a car, we can schedule a meeting with one of our sales consultants. Otherwise..." Sound of tension building as Darryl responds with calm but firm resolve. "Otherwise?" Darryl asks, his tone still calm, though there's a noticeable edge to his voice now. Susan narrows her eyes. "Otherwise," she says, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Music becomes faintly ominous, tension in the air. The words hang in the air, heavy with implication. Darryl stands still, his gaze locked on hers, the weight of the moment settling in. Then, slowly, Darryl reaches into his pocket and pulls out his phone. "All right," he says calmly, scrolling through his contacts. "I'll make the call myself." Sound of phone unlocking, subtle tap of fingers on the screen. Susan blinks, brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you doing?" she asks, her voice cracking slightly. "Just calling the owner," Daryl replies, lifting the phone to his ear. "Shouldn't take long." Sound of phone call ringing, then briefly cut off as Susan watches in silence. Susan's confidence falters, her irritation giving way to confusion. She opens her mouth to speak, but no words come out. Around them, a few employees stop what they're doing, their attention now focused on the unfolding scene. Daryl holds up a finger, signaling for them to wait, then turns slightly away, speaking into the phone. "Yeah, it's me," he says, voice steady. "I'm at the dealership. Everything's fine, just a little misunderstanding. Could you let them know I'm here?" Sound of the call ending, phone sliding back into Daryl's pocket. Daryl turns back to Susan, a faint but assured smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "They'll be here shortly," he says simply. Slight pause, tension in the room. Susan stares at him, mouth slightly open, caught in a moment of disbelief. "Who?" she finally asks, her voice barely above a whisper. Daryl doesn't answer immediately. Instead, he glances around the showroom, his eyes meeting those of the staff who are now watching intently. "Guess we'll find out," he says, his tone almost playful. Sound of muffled murmurs growing in the background. The tension in the room is palpable, thick with anticipation. The few employees scattered around the showroom whisper to each other, stealing glances at the unfolding scene. Everyone is waiting, for something, or someone. Sound of a door opening. The sound of the main door's opening cuts through the silence. A sharply dressed man in a navy suit steps inside. His polished shoes click softly against the tile floor. His expression is serious but warm, and his eyes immediately find Daryl. "Mr. Carter," the man says with a wide smile, extending his hand as he approaches. "So good to see you." Sound of a firm handshake. Daryl returns the handshake, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Thanks for coming, Alex. Appreciate it." Sound of a sharp intake of breath, then sudden quiet. The room collectively stiffens. Susan's clipboard nearly slips from her hands as she darts her eyes between Daryl and Alex, her confusion quickly morphing into alarm. "Mr. Carter," she repeats, her voice uncertain. Alex turns to her, his friendly demeanor shifting into something more professional, almost curt. "Susan," Alex says, acknowledging her briefly. "I see you've already met Mr. Carter." Sound of subtle gasp from the employees, a few whispering quietly. Susan's mouth opens and closes, her mind clearly racing for the right words. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize?" Alex asks, his tone sharper now. "He's the new owner of this dealership," Alex says, finishing the sentence for her. His voice is firm and businesslike. Slight silence hangs in the air. Alex glances at Daryl, offering an apologetic look. "I trust this wasn't your ideal welcome?" "Of course. Here's the next part." Soft background music fades in, building in tension. Daryl raises a hand, signaling for Alex to stop. He gives him a reassuring smile before turning his attention back to Susan. "It's all right, Alex," Daryl says calmly. "I think Susan and I just got off on the wrong foot." Sound of Susan shifting uncomfortably in her seat. His voice is calm, but there's a weight to his words that seems to make the entire room hold its breath. Susan's face turns ashen, and she takes a small step back, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. I'm so sorry," she stammers, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know." Daryl gives her a small nod, his expression unreadable. "You didn't know what?" he asks, his voice gentle but firm. "That I could own a place like this? That someone like me might actually belong here?" Slight pause, a shift in the atmosphere. For a moment, Susan seems utterly lost for words, her mouth opening and closing as she searches for an explanation. I didn't mean, she trails off, but Daryl cuts her off with a raised hand. It's fine, Susan. Really? Soft sigh from Daryl, a subtle yet authoritative tone. He takes a step closer, his voice dropping just enough to make everyone in the room lean in, hanging on his every word. But let me ask you something, he continues. If I hadn't been the owner, would you have treated me any differently? Would you have given me the same respect you'd give someone who walked in here wearing a suit and tie? Slight gasp from the room, everyone on edge. Susan opens her mouth to respond, but no words come out. The silence in the room is deafening. Daryl nods slightly, his gaze steady. I think your silence answers that for me. Sound of a deep breath, tension in the room palpable. He turns to Alex, his voice carrying a new authority now. Let's gather everyone in the conference room, Daryl says firmly. I think it's time we had a little chat about how things are run around here. Sound of feet shuffling, staff murmuring as they start to move toward the conference room. The employees file into the sleek conference room, their movements stiff, the air thick with tension. The room, designed to impress, is all glass walls and modern furnishings, but today, it feels stifling. Slight buzz of low conversation fades out. Susan takes a seat near the back, her usual confident demeanor replaced with a nervous stillness. Daryl stands at the head of the table, his calm and collected presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Alex remains near the door, arms crossed, his expression unreadable as he watches the staff take their seats. Sound of a chair creaking slightly as Daryl shifts his position. The quiet murmur of whispers dies down as Daryl clears his throat, his gaze sweeping across the group. Thank you all for joining me on short notice, Daryl begins, his tone measured, firm, yet calm. For those of you who don't know, my name is Daryl Carter, and as of last month, I'm the new owner of Prestige Motors. Sound of murmurs and surprised gasps from the employees. There's an audible shift in the room, reactions range from curiosity to embarrassment. Susan sinks lower in her chair, avoiding eye contact. Daryl lets the silence settle for a moment before continuing. I came here today dressed casually for a reason, he says. I wanted to see how this dealership operates when no one knows who I am. I wanted to experience what a potential customer might feel, walking through these doors. Pause for emphasis, the music softens. He lets the words settle in, the impact of his statement hanging heavy in the air. What I experienced today was disappointing, Daryl continues. I was judged, not for what I could bring to the table, but for how I looked. Soft sound of Susan shifting uncomfortably. I'm not here to single anyone out, Daryl says. But we need to talk about what that says about the culture of this dealership. Slight pause as Daryl glances at Susan, his gaze steady. Susan shifts in her seat, her face flushed with embarrassment. Daryl's eyes move back to the group as a whole, his voice taking on a more resolute tone. This isn't just about me, he says. It's about every person who walks through those doors. Every customer who doesn't fit into someone's preconceived notion of what a luxury car buyer looks like. Sound of a hesitant voice speaking up. One of the younger sales associates raises his hand, his voice tentative. Mr. Carter, the man begins nervously. I think most of us try to treat customers fairly. But sometimes, sometimes it's hard not to make assumptions. Sound of Daryl nodding slowly, thoughtful. Daryl nods in understanding, his expression thoughtful. I get that, he says. We all have biases, whether we want to admit it or not. But here's the thing. Sound of a brief pause. It's not enough to just try to be fair, he continues. We have to actively challenge those biases. We have to create an environment where everyone feels respected, regardless of their appearance, background, or anything else. Soft hum of agreement from the staff. He pauses for a moment, letting the words sink in. This dealership has built a reputation for excellence, Daryl continues, his voice steady. But excellence isn't just about the cars we sell. It's about the experience we provide. And from now on, that experience is going to be built on respect, inclusivity, and fairness. Sound of a ripple of agreement around the room. There's a ripple of agreement from the employees, though a few faces remain wary. Daryl's gaze lands on Susan, who is sitting frozen, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Slight pause as Daryl shifts his gaze toward Susan. "Susan," he says gently, but firmly. "I want to give you the opportunity to speak. Is there anything you'd like to say?" Sound of a nervous, shaky voice from Susan. All eyes turn to her. She hesitates, her voice barely audible. I made a mistake," she admits, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I misjudged you. And for that, I'm truly sorry." Pause as Daryl considers her words. Daryl nods, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for saying that," he replies. "I hope this experience serves as a reminder for all of us, not just you. Because change starts with accountability." Slight sound of tension releasing from the group. He turns back to the rest of the team, his voice steady and resolute. "Moving forward," Daryl says, "we'll be implementing new training programs to ensure this dealership represents the values I believe in." Sound of Daryl's voice growing more authoritative. "Every customer deserves to be treated with dignity, no exceptions. If anyone has an issue with that, now's the time to speak up." Sound of silence hanging in the room, all eyes on the employees. The room is silent. The silence is deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. No one speaks. The weight of Daryl's words lingers, pressing on everyone present. Daryl lets the quiet stretch, just long enough to make his point. Sound of Daryl speaking again, calm but resolute. "Good," he says, breaking the silence. "I'm glad to see we're all on the same page. Change isn't always easy, but it's necessary. And this dealership is going to lead by example." Sound of chairs shifting as people begin to stir. He takes a step away from the table, his hands resting lightly on its edge as he leans forward slightly. "Let me make something clear," Daryl says, his voice firm but calm. "I didn't come here today to humiliate anyone. I came to understand what kind of culture I've inherited, and how we can make it better." Sound of a deep breath from the group. He looks at Susan, who is still sitting quietly near the back of the room. "Susan," he says, his tone softening just enough to make it clear he isn't attacking her. "You're an experienced manager. I'm sure you've worked hard to get where you are. But today was a wake-up call for you, and for all of us." Slight pause. Susan looks up, meeting his gaze for the first time since the meeting began. "I understand," she says, her voice shaky but sincere. "I was wrong. And I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Sound of Daryl nodding, his expression serious but not unkind. Daryl nods once more, his voice firm. "I believe in second chances," he says simply. "But accountability comes first. I'll be meeting with you one-on-one to discuss next steps." Sound of the room quieting as Daryl concludes. "For now," he says, straightening up and looking at the rest of the group, "let's focus on moving forward." Sound of chairs shifting, people getting comfortable. Daryl takes a moment, letting his words settle into the room. "We're not just selling cars here," he continues, his voice carrying the weight of authority and purpose. "We're building trust, creating relationships, and representing a standard of excellence." Sound of the staff shifting in their seats, a new sense of purpose in the air. "If you're on board with that," Daryl says firmly, "I'm here to support you every step of the way." Sound of a murmur of agreement, some of the tension lifting. The employees seem to relax, the initial tension giving way to a sense of renewed purpose. Even Alex, who has been standing quietly by the door, nods in approval. Daryl smiles faintly, a smile that hints at both relief and determination. All right then, let's get back to work, he says. And remember, how we treat people matters more than anything we sell. Sound of the room buzzing with quiet energy as people begin to stand and file out. As the employees begin to file out of the conference room, Daryl catches sight of Susan lingering by the door. She approaches him hesitantly, her hands twisting nervously. "Mr. Carter," she begins, her voice low, almost unsure. I want to thank you for giving me a chance to do better. I won't let you down." Sound of a brief pause, a soft but resolute response. Daryl looks at her for a moment, his expression steady. "I hope you mean that, Susan," he says. "Actions speak louder than words. But I believe people can change, if they're willing to try." Sound of a soft sigh, Susan nods earnestly. She nods, her eyes earnest. "I am." Sound of the door opening softly as she leaves the room. Daryl watches her leave, then turns to Alex. "Let's set up a meeting with the staff next week," he says. "I want to make sure everyone knows what's expected moving forward." Sound of Alex's response, warm and respectful. Alex grins, his respect for Daryl evident. "You've got it, boss." Sound of footsteps moving toward the showroom, light background chatter begins to fade in. As Daryl steps back into the showroom, he glances around at the cars, the gleaming surfaces reflecting the afternoon light. He can't help but think about how much work lies ahead. But for the first time that day, he feels optimistic. Sound of a soft sigh, a quiet moment of contemplation. This wasn't just about running a dealership. It was about creating something bigger. Sound of footsteps echoing in the showroom, subtle background music transitions to a hopeful tone. A space where people are judged by their character, not their appearance. And Daryl was ready to lead the way.